The small farming community of Ellsworth, Kansas, had always been the kind of place where people knew their neighbors and left their doors unlocked at night. In the early hours of a cold February morning in 1953, that sense of safety was shattered forever when the body of a
Nothing
young
like a warm
schoolteacher was
breakfast before the
discovered in
morning
a ravine
chores.
just outside of
Here's your
town.
coffee,
For
dear.
more than 7
freezing out
decades, the
there.
case remained unsolved, a dark shadow hanging over the prairie town and a source of endless speculation and grief for those who remembered that terrible winter. The arrest that came in late October of 2025 sent shockwaves through the community and beyond, bringing both relief and disbelief to a town that had long ago resigned itself to never knowing the truth. Dorothy Mee Sullivan was 24 years old when she died. She had moved to Ellsworth from Topeka just 6 months earlier to take a teaching position at the local elementary school, where she quickly became beloved by students and parents alike. Friends described her as warm and kind, with a gentle manner that put even the shyest children at ease. She lived in a small rented room above the general store on Main Street and spent her weekends writing letters to her family back in Topeka and preparing lessons for her second-grade classroom. On the evening of February 13, 1953, Dorothy attended a Friday night social at the community hall, a regular gathering where townspeople came together for dancing and conversation. Several witnesses recalled seeing her leave the event around 10:30 that evening, walking alone down Main Street toward her room. She was never seen alive again. When Dorothy failed to appear at church the following Sunday morning, her landlady became concerned. Dorothy was known for her punctuality and devotion, never missing a service without sending word ahead. The landlady climbed the stairs to Dorothy's room and knocked on the door, receiving no answer. After several minutes of increasingly worried knocking, she used her spare key to enter the room. Everything appeared to be in order. The bed was neatly made, Dorothy's Sunday dress was laid out across the chair, and her Bible sat on the nightstand where she always kept it. But Dorothy herself was nowhere to be found. The landlady immediately contacted the sheriff, a man named Robert Hendricks who had held the position for nearly 15 years and prided himself on knowing everything that happened in his town. Sheriff Hendricks began his investigation that afternoon, questioning everyone who had attended the social on Friday evening. Multiple witnesses confirmed that Dorothy had left alone, declining offers from several people to walk her home. She had seemed in good spirits, they said, laughing and chatting throughout the evening. No one had noticed anything unusual or concerning about her behavior or demeanor. The sheriff organized search parties that combed through the town and surrounding farmland, calling Dorothy's name into the winter wind. For 2 days, volunteers searched barns and outbuildings, walked the creek beds, and drove the back roads looking for any sign of the missing teacher. The breakthrough came on Monday afternoon when a farmer checking his fence line along County Road 7 discovered something that made his blood run cold. The ravine where Dorothy's body was found was about 3 miles outside of town, a desolate spot where the wind swept across the open prairie, and the nearest farmhouse was more than a mile away. Her body had been partially concealed beneath branches and prairie grass, but the farmer's sharp eyes had caught sight of her distinctive blue coat. Sheriff Hendricks arrived at the scene within 20 minutes, bringing with him the town doctor who served as the county coroner. What they found painted a grim picture. Dorothy had been struck on the head with a blunt object, the coroner determined, and there were signs of a struggle. Her purse was missing, along with a small gold locket she always wore around her neck, a gift from her grandmother. The investigation that followed would become one of the most intensive the county had ever seen, but it would ultimately lead nowhere. In 1953, forensic science was in its infancy. There were no DNA tests, no computerized fingerprint databases, no surveillance cameras or cell phone records to track movements and establish timelines. Sheriff Hendricks and his small department did everything they could with the tools available to them. They questioned dozens of people, took fingerprints from anyone who had been at the social that night, and followed up on every tip and rumor that came their way. Several individuals emerged as persons of interest during those first few weeks. There was Harold Brewster, a drifter who had been seen around town in the days leading up to Dorothy's disappearance and who vanished shortly after her body was discovered. There was Thomas Garrett, a local farmhand with a reputation for drinking and getting into fights, who had been seen watching Dorothy at the social with what some described as an unsettling intensity. And there was even speculation about Martin Cross, a married businessman who had been rumored to have taken an inappropriate interest in the young teacher. Each of these men was questioned extensively. Harold Brewster was eventually tracked down in Colorado, where he had a solid alibi for the night of Dorothy's disappearance, confirmed by multiple witnesses, and a jail record showing he had been arrested for vagrancy in Denver on February 14th. Thomas Garrett insisted he had gone straight home after the social and had spent the rest of the weekend working on his employer's farm. His employer, a respected rancher named William McKay, confirmed that Thomas had been present and accounted for throughout the weekend, though he acknowledged that the farm was large enough that Thomas could have slipped away without being noticed. Martin Cross denied any improper relationship with Dorothy, and his wife provided him with an alibi, stating he had been home with her all weekend. The investigation eventually stalled, with no physical evidence linking any suspect to the crime and no witnesses who could place anyone suspicious near the ravine or with Dorothy after she left the social. The case remained open but went cold within a few months. Sheriff Hendricks continued to pursue leads as they came in, but as the years passed, those leads became fewer and farther between. The sheriff retired in 1968, still haunted by his failure to solve Dorothy's murder. The case file was passed from one sheriff to the next, each reviewing it periodically but finding nothing new to pursue. The people of Ellsworth gradually stopped talking about Dorothy Mee Sullivan, though the older residents never forgot. Her murder became a local legend of sorts, a cautionary tale that mothers would tell their daughters about the dangers that could lurk even in the safest seeming places. The elementary school where she had taught established a scholarship in her memory, awarded each year to a student who exemplified the kindness and dedication that Dorothy had shown in her brief time there. Decades passed and the world changed around Ellsworth. The small farming community gradually transformed, with some families moving away and new people moving in. The general store where Dorothy had rented her room was torn down in the 1980s and replaced with a small shopping center. Most of the people who had known Dorothy personally passed away, taking their memories with them. By the time the 21st century arrived, Dorothy's murder had faded into local history, a tragedy that seemed destined to remain forever unsolved. The original case file, yellowed with age and smelling of must, sat in a storage room at the county sheriff's office, occasionally pulled out by a curious deputy or a journalist writing a story about historic crimes, but always returned to its shelf with a sense of resignation. The breakthrough that would finally solve Dorothy's murder came from an unexpected source and relied on technology that would have seemed like pure science fiction to Sheriff Hendricks and his deputies back in 1953. In 2023, the current sheriff of Ellsworth County, a woman named Jennifer Morrison, who had held the position for 6 years, attended a conference on cold case investigations. At the conference, she learned about advances in forensic genetic genealogy, a technique that combines DNA analysis with traditional genealogy research to identify suspects in cold cases. The method had gained prominence through its use in solving the infamous Golden State Killer case in California, and law enforcement agencies across the country were beginning to explore whether it could be applied to their own unsolved crimes. Sheriff Morrison returned from the conference energized and determined to take a fresh look at some of the county's cold cases. The Dorothy Mee Sullivan murder was at the top of her list. The case had always intrigued her, not just because of its historical significance to the community, but because of the injustice of a young woman's murder going unpunished for so long. The first challenge was determining whether any physical evidence from the original crime scene still existed. Morrison and her chief deputy spent several days going through the storage room, searching through boxes and file cabinets that hadn't been opened in years. What they found exceeded their hopes. Tucked away in a sealed evidence box that had been properly stored in a cool, dry section of the storage room, they discovered several items collected from the crime scene, including swabs that had been taken from beneath Dorothy's fingernails and a cigarette butt found near where her body had been discovered. In 1953, these items had been collected on the off chance they might prove useful, but the technology to extract meaningful information from them simply did not exist. Now, more than 70 years later, They represented a potential goldmine of DNA evidence. Sheriff Morrison contacted a private forensic laboratory that specialized in extracting DNA from old and degraded samples. The lab warned her that there were no guarantees, given the age of the evidence and the conditions under which it had been stored, but they agreed to attempt the extraction. Several months passed while the lab worked on the samples, using cutting-edge techniques to isolate and amplify whatever genetic material might remain. In June of 2024, Sheriff Morrison received the call she had been hoping for. The lab had successfully extracted a DNA profile from the cigarette butt and a partial profile from the material under Dorothy's fingernails. The DNA profiles were uploaded to the Combined DNA Index System, known as CODIS, the FBI's database of DNA profiles from convicted offenders and crime scenes. This was standard procedure, and Morrison was hopeful that they might get an immediate match if the perpetrator had been arrested for another crime at some point in the intervening decades. However, the search came back with no hits. The person who had left that DNA had never been arrested for a crime serious enough to require a DNA sample, or had died before DNA collection became routine in the criminal justice system. This was disappointing but not surprising, and it was where forensic genetic genealogy offered a new avenue of investigation. With the DNA profile in hand, Sheriff Morrison contacted a genetic genealogy company that worked with law enforcement agencies on cold cases. The process of forensic genetic genealogy is both scientifically sophisticated and remarkably old-fashioned in its approach. The DNA profile from the crime scene was used to search genealogy databases where people have voluntarily uploaded their own DNA results to find relatives and build family trees. These databases contain millions of profiles from people interested in learning about their ancestry. When a match is found, it indicates a biological relationship between the crime scene DNA and the person in the database. The strength of that match indicates how close the relationship is. A direct match would mean the person themselves committed the crime, but more commonly, the matches are to more distant relatives such as second cousins or third cousins once removed. From there, genetic genealogists work backward, using traditional genealogy methods to build family trees and identify potential suspects who fit the profile. The genetic genealogy team assigned to Dorothy's case began their work in August of 2024. They found several matches in the databases, all indicating relationships in the range of second to fourth cousins. This meant that they shared a common ancestor with the unknown suspect, likely someone who had lived in the 1800s or early 1900s. The genealogists began the painstaking process of building family trees for each of these matches, searching through census records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, death certificates, obituaries, and any other documents that could help establish family connections. They looked for branches of these family trees that included individuals who would have been in Kansas in 1953 and who fit the general profile of the suspect, which at this point was simply someone who could have been in Ellsworth on the night Dorothy disappeared. The work took months. Genetic genealogy is not a quick process, and the further back in time a case goes, the more difficult it becomes to trace family lines and identify living descendants. The genealogists working on Dorothy's case were experienced professionals who had solved numerous cold cases, but even for them, this case presented unique challenges. Many of the records they needed were not digitized and required visits to county courthouses and historical societies across Kansas and neighboring states. Family trees that seemed promising would hit dead ends or reveal that entire branches of a family had moved out of state generations ago. But slowly, through persistent and meticulous work, a picture began to emerge. Multiple family trees converged on a single family that had deep roots in Kansas, including several members who had lived in or near Ellsworth in the 1950s. By February of 2025, exactly 72 years after Dorothy's murder, the genetic genealogists had narrowed their focus to one individual. His name was Robert Dale Fisher, and the more the investigators learned about him, the more he seemed to fit the profile of Dorothy's killer. Robert Fisher had been born in 1931, making him 21 years old at the time of the murder. He had grown up on a farm about 15 miles outside of Ellsworth and was known to frequent the town, particularly on Friday and Saturday nights when young people gathered for social events. According to records the investigators were able to locate, Fisher had left Kansas rather abruptly in the spring of 1953, moving to Oklahoma City, where he found work in construction. He had married a few years later and raised a family, keeping a low profile and apparently living a quiet, law-abiding life. Robert Fisher had died in 2009 at the age of 78, taking whatever secrets he held to his grave. But he had left behind 3 adult children and several grandchildren. Sheriff Morrison faced a delicate situation. She needed to confirm that Robert Fisher was indeed the source of the DNA found at Dorothy's crime scene, but to do so, she would need a DNA sample from one of his living relatives for comparison. She could not simply contact them out of the blue and ask for their DNA without revealing the nature of the investigation, and she had no legal grounds to compel them to provide a sample. The solution came through careful surveillance and what law enforcement calls abandoned DNA. One of Robert Fisher's sons, a man named David Fisher who was 65 years old and lived in Wichita, Kansas, became the focus of the investigation. Over the course of several weeks in the spring of 2025, investigators quietly followed David Fisher's movements and waited for an opportunity to collect a DNA sample that he had discarded in a public place. The legal principle is straightforward. When someone throws something away in a public space, they have no reasonable expectation of privacy regarding that item, and law enforcement can legally collect it. The opportunity came on a Tuesday afternoon in April when David Fisher stopped at a coffee shop in Wichita. Investigators watched as he finished his coffee and threw the paper cup in a trash receptacle before driving away. They retrieved the cup and sent it to the lab for analysis. The DNA extracted from the rim of the cup was compared to the DNA profile from Dorothy's crime scene. The results provided the confirmation Sheriff Morrison had been seeking. David Fisher's DNA showed that he was a close biological relative of whoever had left DNA at the crime scene, and given the family tree that had been constructed, the only person who fit all the criteria was his father, Robert Dale Fisher. With this confirmation in hand, Sheriff Morrison faced another decision. Robert Fisher was dead and could not be prosecuted for Dorothy's murder. However, as she dug deeper into Robert Fisher's life, she made a discovery that changed everything. Robert and his wife had adopted a son in 1972, a boy they had named Michael Fisher. What the genealogists had not initially known was that Michael Fisher was not actually Robert's biological child, but rather his nephew. Robert's younger brother Thomas Fisher had gotten a young woman pregnant in 1971, but was unwilling or unable to raise the child. Robert and his wife, who had been struggling with infertility, had agreed to adopt the baby and raise him as their own. Michael Fisher had grown up believing Robert was his biological father, and according to all legal documents, Robert was listed as his father. Michael Fisher was 53 years old and lived in Salina, Kansas, where he worked as a maintenance supervisor at a manufacturing plant. He had never been in trouble with the law beyond a couple of traffic tickets. He was married with 2 teenage children and was by all accounts a devoted family man and a reliable employee. What Sheriff Morrison discovered through her investigation, however, was that Michael Fisher had inherited more than just his adopted father's name. When investigators obtained Michael Fisher's DNA through the same abandoned DNA technique, collecting a sample from a water bottle he discarded at a gas station, the results were stunning. Michael Fisher's DNA was a match to the DNA found at Dorothy Sullivan's crime scene. This seemed impossible at first. Michael had not been born until 1972, 19 years after Dorothy's murder. But the explanation, once the investigators understood it, was both scientifically sound and deeply disturbing. Robert Dale Fisher had not acted alone in murdering Dorothy Sullivan. The DNA evidence suggested that both Robert and his brother Thomas had been involved in the crime. The genetic markers found at the crime scene indicated DNA from at least 2 sources, something that had not been apparent in the initial analysis, but became clear when the samples were re-examined with more sophisticated techniques. Thomas Fisher had died in 1993, but his biological son Michael carried his DNA. When Michael's DNA was compared to the crime scene evidence, It showed a familial match because Michael had inherited approximately 50% of his DNA from Thomas, just as any child inherits from their biological parent. This meant that Thomas Fisher's DNA, left at the scene of Dorothy's murder, could be partially matched through his son Michael, even though Michael himself had nothing to do with the crime. The investigation now had to reconstruct what had happened that cold February night in 1953. Sheriff Morrison and her team, working with the genetic genealogists and cold case specialists, began piecing together the lives of Robert and Thomas Fisher in the early 1950s. Thomas Fisher had been 18 years old in 1953, 3 years younger than his brother Robert. Records showed that both brothers had attended the Friday night social, where Dorothy Sullivan was last seen alive. Several elderly residents of Ellsworth who were contacted by investigators had vague memories of the Fisher brothers, describing them as rowdy young men who drank too much and sometimes got into fights. One elderly woman, now 94 years old and living in a nursing home in Salina, recalled with surprising clarity that she had seen Robert Fisher watching Dorothy Sullivan at the social, and that his brother Thomas had been with him. The theory that emerged from the investigation was that Robert and Thomas Fisher had followed Dorothy when she left the social that night. Whether they had planned to harm her or whether the attack was spontaneous remains unknown, and likely will never be known with certainty. What the evidence suggests is that there was a confrontation, possibly an attempted robbery or assault, that escalated into murder. The cigarette butt found near Dorothy's body had been tested and contained DNA matching the Fisher family line. The material under Dorothy's fingernails, which had provided a partial DNA profile, also matched the Fisher line. This suggested that Dorothy had fought back against her attackers, scratching at least one of them, and leaving behind crucial evidence that would not be understood or usable for more than 70 years. After the murder, the Fisher brothers had apparently kept their secret. They had disposed of Dorothy's purse and locket, items that were never recovered despite extensive searches at the time and renewed searches in recent years. Robert Fisher had left Kansas just a few months after the murder, a departure that at the time had not seemed particularly suspicious, as many young people left small farming communities to seek opportunities in cities. Thomas Fisher had remained in Kansas, living a quiet life and showing no outward signs of the terrible secret he carried. The brothers had apparently maintained their silence even between themselves. When Sheriff Morrison interviewed members of the Fisher family after the DNA evidence came to light, none of them had ever heard any hint or suggestion that Robert or Thomas had been involved in Dorothy's murder. Robert's widow, now 92 years old and living with severe dementia, could provide no information. Thomas's widow had died several years earlier. The arrest that shocked the community came on October 28, 2025. Sheriff Morrison, after consulting with the county prosecutor and legal experts, made the decision to arrest Michael Fisher and charge him as an accessory after the fact to murder. The legal theory was complex and unprecedented in Kansas law. While Michael Fisher himself had not been involved in Dorothy Sullivan's murder, the prosecutor argued that by benefiting from the actions of his biological father Thomas and his adoptive father Robert, specifically by being raised in a family whose circumstances had been shaped by their crime and their evasion of justice, and by potentially having knowledge of the crime through family information, Michael Fisher had in effect become an accessory. The arrest took place at Michael's workplace, with television cameras capturing the moment that shocked not just Ellsworth, but the entire state of Kansas. The legal community immediately erupted in debate over the charges. Defense attorneys called it an outrageous overreach, arguing that a person cannot be held criminally liable for crimes committed before they were born, regardless of biological relationships. Constitutional scholars raised questions about whether charging Michael Fisher violated basic principles of justice and fairness. The prosecutor, a determined woman named Patricia Henning, who had held her position for 12 years, defended the charges by arguing that new evidence suggested Michael Fisher had known about his father's involvement in Dorothy's murder for several years, but had never come forward to authorities. This evidence consisted of a journal allegedly belonging to Thomas Fisher that had been found in a storage unit Michael had inherited after his biological mother's death. The journal purportedly contained entries in which Thomas Fisher had expressed guilt about events that occurred in February of 1953 and mentioned his brother Robert's panic and their shared secret. Michael Fisher's attorney, a prominent defense lawyer from Topeka named Richard Callahan, immediately moved to have the charges dismissed, arguing that the evidence was insufficient and that the legal theory was fundamentally flawed. He pointed out that even if Michael Fisher had discovered information about his father's involvement in an old crime, there is no legal requirement for ordinary citizens to report historical information about crimes to authorities, particularly when the perpetrators are already deceased and beyond prosecution. The case quickly became a media sensation, with legal analysts and talk show hosts across the country weighing in on the unprecedented nature of the charges. Some supported the prosecutor's aggressive approach, arguing that justice for Dorothy Sullivan demanded that someone be held accountable, and that Michael Fisher's failure to come forward with information about the crime made him complicit. Others saw the case as a dangerous example of prosecutorial overreach that could set a troubling precedent. The small community of Ellsworth found itself divided. Many residents were simply relieved to finally know who had killed Dorothy Sullivan and grateful for the resolution that the DNA evidence had provided. For them, the arrest of Michael Fisher, while controversial, represented some form of justice and accountability. Others felt sympathy for Michael, seeing him as an innocent victim of circumstances beyond his control, a man whose life had been destroyed because of crimes committed by family members before he was born. Local churches held prayer vigils, some in support of the Fisher family and others in memory of Dorothy Sullivan. The elementary school where Dorothy had taught held a special assembly to honor her memory and to explain to students why their quiet town was suddenly the center of a national news story. As the legal proceedings moved forward through the fall of 2025, the case took another unexpected turn. Richard Callahan, Michael Fisher's attorney, announced that he had hired his own genetic genealogy experts to review the DNA evidence. These experts identified what they claimed were significant problems with the prosecution's interpretation of the genetic evidence. They argued that the DNA matches were not as definitive as the prosecution claimed, and that the complex family relationships in the Fisher family, including multiple instances of intermarriage between branches of extended family, made it impossible to say with certainty that Thomas Fisher had been at the crime scene. They also challenged the authenticity of the journal that the prosecution claimed showed Michael Fisher had knowledge of the crime, bringing in handwriting experts who testified that the handwriting in the journal did not match known samples of Thomas Fisher's writing from the same time period. The preliminary hearing, held in early November 2025 in the Ellsworth County Courthouse, drew spectators from across the state. The courtroom, built in the 1920s with high ceilings and wooden benches, was packed with journalists, legal observers, and local residents who had come to witness this historic moment. Sheriff Morrison testified about the investigation, walking the court through the painstaking process of extracting and analyzing the DNA evidence and building the family trees that had led to the Fisher family. The genetic genealogists testified about their methods and their confidence in their conclusions. The prosecutor presented the journal entries and argued that they clearly showed Thomas Fisher's guilt and that Michael Fisher's possession of the journal for several years, without reporting its contents to authorities, constituted criminal behavior. The defense presented its own experts who challenged every aspect of the prosecution's case. Forensic DNA experts testified about the limitations of DNA analysis on samples that were more than 70 years old, and that had been stored under less than ideal conditions for most of that time. They pointed out that degradation of DNA over time can lead to partial profiles that are open to interpretation, and that declaring a definitive match based on such evidence requires multiple assumptions that may or may not be valid. Genetic genealogy experts testified about the complexities of the Fisher family tree and the possibility of alternative explanations for the DNA matches. Handwriting experts challenged the authenticity of the journal, and character witnesses, including Michael Fisher's employer, his pastor, and longtime friends, testified about his reputation for honesty and integrity. Michael Fisher himself took the stand on the third day of the preliminary hearing. It was the first time most people had heard him speak, and his testimony was emotional and compelling. He described learning only recently that Robert Fisher was not his biological father, a revelation that had shaken his sense of identity and family. He acknowledged that he had found the journal among his biological mother's belongings after her death, but stated that he had not understood its significance at the time and had not read it carefully. He denied any knowledge of his father's involvement in Dorothy Sullivan's murder until he was contacted by Sheriff Morrison's investigators. He expressed sympathy for Dorothy Sullivan and her family, but insisted that he himself had done nothing wrong and should not be held accountable for crimes committed decades before his birth by men he had known only as a nephew knows his uncles or a son knows his father. The judge, a veteran of 23 years on the bench named Howard Mitchell, took the matter under advisement at the conclusion of the preliminary hearing. He announced that he would issue his ruling within 30 days. The waiting period was agonizing for everyone involved. Michael Fisher remained free on bond, continuing to live with his family in Salina, but finding that his life had been irrevocably changed by the charges. He had been placed on leave from his job, and his children had been subjected to harassment and bullying at school by classmates who had seen the news coverage. His wife stood by him publicly, but the strain on their marriage was evident. In Ellsworth, the community continued to grapple with the revelations about Dorothy Sullivan's murder and the complicated questions of justice and accountability that the case had raised. On December 8, 2025, Judge Mitchell issued his ruling. In a detailed written opinion that ran to 47 pages, he dismissed all charges against Michael Fisher. The judge found that while the DNA evidence strongly suggested that Robert and Thomas Fisher had been involved in Dorothy Sullivan's murder, there was insufficient evidence to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Michael Fisher had knowledge of the crime or had acted in any way as an accessory. Judge Mitchell wrote that the journal entries, even if authentic, were too vague to constitute clear evidence of the specific crime, and that in any case, there is no criminal statute in Kansas that requires a person to report historical information about crimes committed by deceased relatives. He acknowledged the prosecutor's creative legal theory, but found that it stretched the definition of accessory beyond what the law allowed. The judge concluded his opinion with a reflection on the nature of justice and the limits of what the legal system can accomplish. The dismissal of charges brought relief to Michael Fisher and his family, but frustration to those who felt that Dorothy Sullivan's murder deserved more than just historical resolution. Sheriff Morrison held a press conference the day after the ruling in which she stated that while she was disappointed by the dismissal of charges, she was proud of the work her department and the genetic genealogists had done to finally identify Dorothy's killers. She announced that the case was now officially closed, with Robert Dale Fisher and Thomas William Fisher listed as the perpetrators. She expressed hope that this resolution would bring some measure of peace to anyone who still remembered Dorothy Sullivan and cared about justice for her. The sheriff also announced that the county would be placing a memorial marker at the location where Dorothy's body had been found, ensuring that her story would not be forgotten. In the weeks following the dismissal of charges, several media outlets conducted in-depth investigations into the Fisher family and the events of 1953. Journalists tracked down elderly residents of Ellsworth who had been teenagers or young adults at the time of Dorothy's murder and interviewed them about their memories. A few recalled that the Fisher brothers had seemed to change in the weeks after the murder, becoming more withdrawn and serious, but at the time no one had connected this behavioral change to the crime. One particularly poignant interview was with a woman who had been Dorothy Sullivan's roommate briefly before Dorothy moved to Ellsworth. She described Dorothy as a young woman full of hope and dreams, excited about her teaching career and planning to save money to travel to Europe someday. Learning the identity of Dorothy's killers after all these years brought her both closure and renewed grief. The case raised broader questions about the use of genetic genealogy in criminal investigations and the ethical implications of using family members' DNA to solve crimes. Privacy advocates expressed concern about the precedent set by collecting DNA from family members to implicate deceased relatives, arguing that it could discourage people from uploading their DNA to genealogy databases if they feared it might be used to investigate their relatives. Law enforcement officials countered that genetic genealogy had proven to be an invaluable tool for solving cold cases and bringing closure to families who had waited decades for answers. They pointed to the hundreds of cold cases that had been solved using these techniques and argued that the public good outweighed privacy concerns, particularly when the DNA used for comparison came from public databases where people had voluntarily chosen to share their genetic information. The case also sparked discussions about the statute of limitations for murder and the question of whether it makes sense to continue pursuing cases where the perpetrators are deceased and beyond the reach of criminal prosecution. Some argued that devoting substantial resources to solving cases where no living person can be held accountable is not a good use of limited law enforcement resources, particularly when there are active cases and ongoing crimes that need attention. Others maintain that every murder victim deserves justice, regardless of how much time has passed, and that solving cold cases serves important purposes beyond criminal prosecution, including providing closure to families, correcting historical records, and demonstrating that society never forgets victims of violence. For the Fisher family, the revelations about Robert and Thomas Fisher's involvement in Dorothy Sullivan's murder brought shame and soul-searching. Family members struggled to reconcile the men they had known, or thought they had known, with the terrible crime they had committed as young men. Some family members expressed anger at being subjected to investigation and publicity because of crimes they had no part in and no knowledge of. Others expressed sympathy for Dorothy Sullivan and her family, and said they hoped that finally knowing the truth would bring some measure of peace. Michael Fisher gave one final interview several weeks after the charges were dismissed, stating that he was trying to rebuild his life and move forward, but that he would always carry the knowledge of what his fathers had done and the impact it had on an innocent young woman and her family. The memorial marker for Dorothy M. Sullivan was dedicated on a cold afternoon in January 2026, almost exactly 73 years after her death. About 50 people attended the ceremony, including Sheriff Morrison, the current principal of the elementary school where Dorothy had taught, several elderly residents who remembered her, and Michael Fisher, who stood quietly at the back of the small crowd. The marker was simple but elegant, bearing Dorothy's name, the dates of her birth and death, and the words "beloved teacher, forever remembered." The principal of the elementary school announced that the annual scholarship in Dorothy's memory would be expanded and renamed the Dorothy M. Sullivan Justice and Remembrance Scholarship, to be awarded to students interested in pursuing careers in law enforcement, forensic science, or criminal justice. It was a way, she said, of turning tragedy into something positive and ensuring that Dorothy's legacy would inspire future generations to seek truth and justice. The case of Dorothy M. Sullivan's murder and the decades-long quest to solve it stands as a testament to both the power of modern forensic science and the enduring human desire for justice and accountability. The DNA evidence that finally identified her killers after more than 70 years represents a remarkable achievement of scientific progress and investigative persistence. At the same time, the legal and ethical questions raised by the attempt to charge Michael Fisher highlight the complexities and limitations of the justice system when dealing with crimes from the distant past. The case demonstrated that solving a cold case is not the same as achieving justice, and that knowing the truth about what happened, while important, cannot erase the harm that was done or fully satisfy the desire to hold someone accountable. For the community of Ellsworth, Kansas, the resolution of Dorothy Sullivan's murder brought a mixture of emotions. There was relief at finally knowing what had happened to the young teacher who had died so tragically. There was satisfaction in seeing the investigative process work, with dedicated law enforcement officers and scientists refusing to give up on a case that many others would have considered hopeless. There was sadness at the reminder of violence and loss, and at the realization that the men responsible for Dorothy's death had lived long lives without facing consequences for their actions. And there was controversy over the decision to charge Michael Fisher, with the community divided over whether it represented a zealous pursuit of justice or an unfair attack on an innocent man. The story of Dorothy M. Sullivan serves as a reminder that violent crimes leave ripples that extend far beyond the immediate victim and the immediate aftermath. Her murder affected not just her own family, who mourned her loss and wondered for decades what had happened to her, but also the community where she had lived and worked, which lost its sense of safety and innocence. The crime affected the Fisher family, who lived with the secret guilt of what Robert and Thomas had done, even if most family members did not know the truth. And the eventual solving of the case affected Michael Fisher and his immediate family, who found their lives upended by revelations about crimes committed before they were born. The quest for justice in Dorothy's case spanned more than 7 decades and involved hundreds of people, from the sheriff who first investigated her death in 1953 to the genetic genealogists who finally identified her killers in 2025. As of early 2026, the investigation into Dorothy Mee Sullivan's murder is officially closed. The case file, which had been pulled from storage in 2023 after decades of gathering dust, has been updated with all the new evidence and findings and returned to storage, this time with a resolution that the original investigators could never have achieved. The DNA samples that proved crucial to solving the case remain preserved in secure storage, available for any future legal proceedings or challenges, though none are expected. The genetic family trees that were constructed during the investigation have been sealed to protect the privacy of the many Fisher family members who had no involvement in or knowledge of the crime. Sheriff Morrison has moved on to other cases, though she considers the Dorothy Sullivan investigation to be the most significant achievement of her career. The case has been written about extensively in law enforcement journals and forensic science publications as an example of how genetic genealogy can be used to solve even the coldest of cold cases. It has been featured in true crime podcasts and television documentaries, bringing Dorothy's story to audiences far beyond Kansas. The ethical and legal questions raised by the case have been debated in law schools and at conferences of prosecutors and defense attorneys. Some legal scholars have suggested that the case demonstrates the need for new laws and procedures to govern how genetic genealogy is used in criminal investigations, and to clarify the rights and responsibilities of family members when their DNA is used to identify deceased relatives as criminal suspects. For those who knew Dorothy Sullivan, or who remember her story from their childhood in Ellsworth, the resolution of her murder has brought a sense of closure, even if it did not bring the kind of courtroom justice that many had hoped for. The elderly woman who had been Dorothy's roommate said in an interview that just knowing what had happened and who was responsible allowed her to finally let go of decades of wondering and speculation. The knowledge that Dorothy had fought back against her attackers, evidenced by the DNA found beneath her fingernails, gave some comfort to those who loved her, as it showed that she had not gone quietly or passively, but had resisted to the end. The memorial marker at the site where her body was found has become a place of quiet reflection, visited by local residents and by true crime enthusiasts who have learned about the case through media coverage. The farmland where Dorothy died has changed little over the decades. It is still open prairie, with the same wind that blew on that February night in 1953 still sweeping across the landscape. The ravine where her body was concealed is still there, though the specific location is marked now by the memorial stone and is no longer an anonymous patch of ground. The town of Ellsworth itself has grown and changed, but it retains its small-town character. The community hall where Dorothy attended her last social gathering still stands, though it has been renovated several times over the years. The elementary school where she taught has been replaced by a modern building, but her memory is honored there through the scholarship that bears her name and through stories that teachers tell about the dedicated young woman who came to their town so long ago. The story of Dorothy Mee Sullivan's murder and its eventual solution spans nearly 3/4 of a century and represents both the worst and the best of human nature. It shows the capacity for violence and cruelty, the ability of people to commit terrible acts and then carry on with their lives as if nothing had happened. But it also shows the persistence of those who seek justice, the dedication of law enforcement officers who refuse to give up on victims even decades after their deaths, the power of science and technology to uncover truths that once seemed forever hidden, and the importance that communities place on remembering their dead and seeking accountability for crimes committed against them. The The case is a reminder that no murder is truly cold as long as there are people willing to seek the truth, and that advances in science may someday allow even the oldest cases to be solved. In the end, the case of Dorothy Mee Sullivan represents a kind of justice, even if it is not the traditional justice of a courtroom conviction and punishment. The truth about what happened to her is now known. The men who killed her have been identified, even though they escaped earthly justice by dying before they could be held accountable. Their names are now permanently associated with the crime they committed, their reputations forever tarnished by the revelation of what they did on that February night in 1953. Dorothy herself, who might have been forgotten entirely as the decades passed and memories faded, is now remembered not just as a victim but as a person, a young teacher with dreams and plans, whose life was stolen from her but whose story has finally been told. The small memorial marker on the Kansas prairie stands as a testament to her memory and to the idea that every life matters and every victim deserves to have their story known and their death accounted for, no matter how many years may pass.